Gavel things, yeah. So this hearing will come to order. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Joint Economic Committee's hearing titled Help Wanted, a Stronger Labor Market for Robust Growth. I want to thank each of our truly distinguished witnesses for sharing their expertise today. And now I'll do an opening statement before turning to Senator Lee for his. One of the most important things we can do as a Congress is to help build a policy environment that encourages the creation of well-paying, high-quality, safe jobs. Jobs that allow Americans to support themselves and their families, to create opportunities that provide workers with both a steady paycheck and the ability to care for loved ones when they're in need. Ensuring workers can navigate care and work responsibilities is crucial to boosting overall productivity, advancing long-term and robust economic growth, which benefits us all. The purpose of this hearing is to examine the barriers to labor force participation. Why is it that certain workers have been unable to rejoin the workforce? How can policymakers help address this trend? Despite the strength of the nation's ongoing recovery, in which the pace of new jobs created has been steady, with almost 5 million Americans returning to work under President Biden, I believe the most in the first 10 months of any presidency, the uneven return of the workforce we're witnessing really raises some concerns. It's particularly troublesome that women comprise nearly 2 out of the 3 workers who have dropped out of the labor force since the beginning of the pandemic. To understand the current situation, it's useful to look at pre-existing trends in U.S. labor force participation. After increasing dramatically over the second half of the 20th century, women's labor force participation peaked in 2000 and has been declining since then. The reason for much of this decline has been the lack of structural support for women's full participation in the economy, such as paid leave and affordable and accessible childcare. The pandemic highlighted these underlying structural changes confronting our care infrastructure. Women remain the members of the family most often responsible for a greater share of care work. And now facing the burden of inadequate and unaffordable childcare, the impossible choice between caring for a sick loved one or getting a paycheck, or pandemic-related disruptions of schools, many women have been unable to return to the workplace. So if we don't take action to better support women returning to work, we may experience prolonged periods of worker shortages that will hurt our nation's economy. As a small business owner for over 4 decades, I was just bragging that our family business was 48 years old last Saturday. I've seen firsthand how paid leave is important for supporting both small businesses and workers. It's inevitable that workers need to take time off to care for themselves or for a loved one, but only 23% of American workers have access to paid family leave. Unfortunately, the lower wage workers, the ones who are least able to take time away from work to care for a sick child or relative, they're also the workers least likely to get paid leave from their employer. A universal paid leave program would allow parents to look for work with the knowledge that they could care for their kids without losing their paychecks. It would also allow employers to be able to retain experienced workers who need to take leave without having to pay for the leave out of their own pocket, their employer pocket. The good news is we can take from the current strong demand for workers is that we know from the recent past that when there is strong demand, they do return to the labor force. Under President Obama, the U.S. began the longest period of continuous job growth in modern history. And the tightening of the labor market created opportunities for millions of previously marginalized workers to rejoin the workforce and drive up wages, particularly among low-wage earners. So while the coronavirus pandemic rocked the labor market, pushed the labor force participant rate to lows we haven't seen in decades, the hot labor market before the coronavirus pandemic demonstrated that sidelined workers can be brought back into the labor force. And this offers us a useful example as we look to address the current challenges facing workers. But as helpful as strong demand for workers can be in pulling people back into the labor force, we have seen that if we want to make meaningful improvements in labor force participation, we must address these gaps, existing gaps in workforce supports that help workers navigate both jobs and care responsibilities. Workers have made significant progress in the past year. Under President Biden, the unemployment rates dropped to 4.8% in September, 4% in Virginia, beating expectations. Nevertheless, as we see in many different ways, including supply chain disruptions, there's significant turbulence in the labor market. And it's incumbent on this Congress and on the Joint Economic Committee to examine and act on policies that make it possible for Americans to maintain their work responsibilities while ensuring for the well-being of their loved ones. So I'm looking forward to learning from each of the witnesses today, and I'm happy to introduce the Vice Chair of the committee, Senator Lee from Utah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to today's hearing. Throughout the history of our great country, Americans have worked to build businesses and employ workers and support families in the process. Through work, we've developed new ideas that have bettered our own lives and the lives of our neighbors, our communities, and our entire country. When work is no longer a part of our lives, we lose something fundamental to our ability to contribute and to thrive. Work is more than just a source of income. Work connects us with each other, and it connects us with a purpose that's greater than ourselves. But today, work is in a state of crisis in America. Millions of Americans have fallen out of the workforce since the onset of the COVID pandemic. Workers are quitting their jobs at unprecedented rates, and labor unions are striking as demand for labor continues to grow. September's job report shows the smallest gain in payrolls this year, and nearly 5 million Americans are still on the sidelines. Across the country, there are more jobs than there are willing workers. The current employment situation should concern all of us, but declines in labor force attachment actually precede the pandemic. In a new report this week, the Joint Economic Committee Republicans evaluate the years-long question of why so many prime-age, able-bodied Americans have fallen out of the workforce. For men, connections to work have been declining for decades, and hit a record low last year with the onset of the pandemic recession. For women, connections to work started receding in the last 2 decades. Our report finds that government programs and policies are making work less attractive, and that many Americans are voluntarily disconnected from work. That is a problem for our country, and it's certainly a problem for our social fabric. Fortunately, there's a lot that we can do to reconnect people to work. To begin with, we have to start to begin to address existing policy. In many instances, existing policy causes or at least exacerbates some of these problems. Over the last 18 months, Congress increased safety net benefits and left those new and expanded programs in place for too long. Congress authorized unemployment checks that were sometimes twice as large as Americans' paychecks, and provided rent subsidies, stimulus checks, loan forbearance, and new health care coverage, as well as expanded food stamps. Importantly, most of those benefits did not require recipients to look for work even after vaccines were widely available, to protect workers and businesses as they began reopening and rehiring workers again. Current legislative proposals could make many of those anti-work incentives permanent, which is the wrong choice. Instead, Congress urgently needs to implement policies that draw disconnected Americans off the sidelines and into the workforce. Congress must remove disincentives to work by strengthening work requirements and safety net programs for able-bodied workers. We should also be working to eliminate existing barriers to entry. Anytime we can do that, it helps. Some of those barriers include things like occupational licensing and labor regulations that prevent a whole lot of Americans from entering new professions or working flexibly on their own terms. Finally, the federal vaccine mandate is an obstacle to connecting people to work, and there's no legal or constitutional authority for it. The threatened employer mandate has not even been issued yet, and Utahns tell me that it's already jeopardizing their livelihoods and that unvaccinated workers are preemptively being put on unpaid leave, which leaves them without a source of income, yet cruelly also leaves them ineligible for unemployment benefits. Under the mandate, some Americans would be forced to make a personal health decision against their will or face losing their job, and with it, their ability to put food on the table and feed their families. This ultimatum to workers is unacceptable. It's unlawful. It's unconstitutional. But even worse than all these things, it's immoral. It's savagely cruel. It's barbaric. It has no place in our society. Not this one. Never. Note that opposing the mandate is by no means the same as opposing the vaccine. And I do believe the vaccine is something of a medical miracle, one that helps increase safety and security for millions of Americans as we return to places of work. That's why I've been vaccinated. That's why I've encouraged every member of my family to be vaccinated and others generally. But today, we have to acknowledge that that's different than telling everybody he's got to get it, regardless of religious beliefs or pre-existing medical conditions or whatever is on someone's mind, because it's not right to tell people that the government's going to force their employer to fire them, leaving them unemployed, and without access, in many instances, even to unemployment. That is wrong. As of now, we need workers' contributions more than ever. And we cannot pretend to know what's good for every worker or every business. We must put trust back in individuals, back in business owners and local decision makers. We must stop making policy decisions that discourage a return to work. Reconnecting Americans to work is one of the most important policy goals of our time. I look forward to today's conversation on that essential topic. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Lee, very much. I'd now like to introduce our four distinguished witnesses. Dr. Betsy Stevenson is a professor of public policy and economics at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. She served as member of the Council of Economic Advisors from 2013 to 2015, where she advised President Obama on social policy, labor market, and trade issues. She served as chief economist at the U.S. Department of Labor from 2010 to 2011, advising the Secretary of Labor on labor policy and participating as the Secretary's deputy to the White House economic team. Dr. Stevenson has published widely in leading economic journals about the labor market and the impact of public policies on outcomes, both in the labor market and for families as they are adjusting to changing labor market opportunities. Her research explores women's labor market experiences, the economic forces shaping the modern family, and how these labor market experiences and the economic forces on the family influence each other. Dr. Stevenson earned a BA in economics and mathematics from Wellesley College and an MA and PhD in economics from Harvard University. I believe is the only male member of Congress who attended Wellesley. I want to welcome you here especially. Mr. Skanda Amarnath is currently the Executive Director of Employ America, a research and advocacy organization that advocates for macroeconomic policies that promote sustainably tighter labor markets. He was previously a vice president at MKP Capital Management, where he served as a market economist and strategist. Prior to that, he worked as an analyst within the research group at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and graduated from Columbia with degrees in applied mathematics and economics. Mr. Daniel Swenson-Klatt has been the owner and manager since 2006 of Butter Bakery Cafe in Minneapolis, a small neighborhood bakery, cafe, and coffee shop. He's a member of Small Business for Paid Leave. Since 2013, he served as a board member for the Kingfield Neighborhood Association. And prior to the Butter Bakery Cafe, he was a middle school teacher for over 20 years. He holds a bachelor's degree in English language and literature from St. Olaf College. And finally, Ms. Rachel Gressler is a fellow in the Grover M. Herman Center for the Federal Budget at the Heritage Foundation, where she focuses on retirement and labor policies such as Social Security, disability insurance, pensions, and worker compensation. Before joining Heritage in 2013, Ms. Gressler was a senior economist on the staff of the Joint Economic Committee, so welcome back, for 7 years. She completed her graduate studies at Georgetown University, where she earned master's degrees in both economics and public policy. She holds a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Mary Washington. So we will hear your opening testimonies in that order. So Dr. Stevenson, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you today about the labor market. The employment landscape, as you all noted, is in flux. Employment remains well below pre-pandemic levels, and yet employers report shortages of workers. Quits and the intention to quit have hit record highs as workers are seeking and taking advantage of new opportunities. To be clear, most people quitting jobs are immediately heading to other ones, many of whom have already lined those jobs up. Some blame unemployment benefits for keeping workers at home, yet strong evidence directly contests this claim. States that ended unemployment insurance early saw no pronounced rebound in employment. Moreover, some industries have made a full return and currently exceed pre-pandemic employment, even though their workers were also eligible for unemployment insurance. If unemployment insurance is not holding back the labor market, what is? There are three important factors influencing the labor market right now. The ongoing pandemic continues to shape the labor market, from supply chain problems reflecting COVID around the globe to virus-avoiding behavior by both consumers and workers within the United States. The second factor is ongoing challenges in combining work and caregiving. And the third factor is shifting preferences by both consumers and workers that's causing a massive reallocation in the labor market right now. I want to urge you to look below the headline jobs number, because each month in the labor market, roughly 6 million people leave jobs and 6 million people start jobs. The trick to growing employment is to have the number of people starting jobs exceed the number leaving jobs. This means you need to care as much about why people exit the labor force as you care about trying to get people to enter the labor force. And that's why I want to talk to you about caregiving. Challenges providing care for a child or an adult with chronic health issues is a very important reason that many people leave jobs. They may hope to eventually return, but those who leave the labor force have a lower chance of being employed in the future compared to those who are able to meet their family needs while remaining employed. Keeping people in jobs is much easier than helping them return to the labor market. The United States has one of the lowest rates of female labor force participation in the OECD, ranking 23 out of 34 countries. That's not where we used to be. We used to be number 6. What's happened? We've fallen behind other countries in providing family-friendly workplace policies. The late 20th century showed us what adding women to the labor force can do. Prior to the pandemic, our GDP was roughly 15% larger than it would have been if women's employment had been what it was in 1970. Yet, 2 out of every 3 caregivers in the United States are women. So I want to make 3 points about paid leave, because we've had decades to study and learn around the globe, and we now know that paid leave is essential to greater labor force participation. Paid leave increases retention of workers, reducing the chances that they exit employment out of the labor force. The vast majority of businesses find that paid leave is either positive for their business or has no noticeable negative effect. And children benefit from time to bond with a new parent, leading to higher lifetime wages and greater employment as adults. I urge you, as you consider these policies, to care as much about employment in 20 years as you do now. And so thinking about investments in children beyond paid leave, such as through the child tax credit and support for child care services, to support not only our current economy, but our future economy. Because it is ultimately human ingenuity that fuels our economic growth. Economic growth in 20 years depends on the choices we make today about investing in our youngest members of society. Economic growth today depends on the choices that you make to support parents and children. The challenges that parents faced during the pandemic were not unique to the recession. Instead, they highlight our failure to adapt childcare, workplace flexibility, and workplace parental leave policies to meet the needs of a workforce in which women held half of the jobs prior to the pandemic. The choices you make now about paid leave, early childhood education, and childcare will shape the U.S. macroeconomy for decades to come by influencing who returns to work, what types of jobs parents are able to take, and what kinds of promotions parents are able to receive and accept. So I urge you to choose wisely.
Thank you, Dr. Stevenson, very much. Next here from Amarnath.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to testify at this hearing. As was noted, I am the Executive Director of Employ America. We advocate for macroeconomic policies that promote sustainably tighter labor markets. When labor markets are sustainably tighter, businesses actively compete for workers and are incentivized to make investments that improve the productivity of their workforce and their businesses themselves. We are recovering at a rapid pace, but until we can fully get behind this pandemic, we will not be able to recover all the employment that's been lost. The presence of the Delta variant had an identifiable impact on job growth in the food services sector in August and September. And as another stylized example, education employment did not see its usual seasonal upturn in September because the impacts of the pandemic are still preventing a full normalization of conditions. The headline unemployment rate is 1.5% above where it was pre-pandemic, but this understates the true employment gap. The pandemic has also depressed labor force participation, which thereby distorts what the current unemployment rate is really telling us. Some might see this as a byproduct of people exiting the labor force for good, but the truth is we really don't know who is in the labor force and who is out of the labor force with any real precision, accuracy, or consistency. It is simply easier to look at who is employed and who is not employed and then benchmark to population and age structure, which is why I would recommend looking at the 25 to 54-year-old prime age employment rate. I will call it the PER for short. It's still 2.4 percentage points from its pre-pandemic peak, in contrast to the 1.5% unemployment rate differential. That said, the PER has made a whopping gain of 0.8% over the third quarter. And if we can continue to see these types of gains over the coming quarters, we will have made probably a full recovery over the course of next year. And this stands in marked contrast to what we saw in previous recoveries, which I would call jobless recoveries. We had a multi-year period of jobless recoveries after the previous 3 recessions under presidencies of Democrats and Republicans alike. It took over a decade for the PER to recover from the Great Recession. It never recovered from its 2000 peak. The current trajectory might allow us to actually have a recovery in under 3 years. And I would attribute much of the benefits here, obviously every recession is different, but the responsiveness of monetary and fiscal policy has likely played a key role in staving off the worst of recessions in terms of the vicious cycles in cutbacks, layoffs, loan defaults. Policy implementation always has its imperfections, but families across the income distribution have made it out of this pandemic with actually higher cash buffers. And while disincentives are a big sticking point politically, I would say that the best of evidence available does not really show an identifiable effect, especially if we look at the evolution of job growth around unemployment insurance cutoffs. On the other hand, using fiscal policy to keep people whole has allowed a lot of those vicious cycles to not materialize to the same extent, and I think that's a big reason for why we have seen such a rapid recovery in contrast to previous recoveries. Tighter labor markets, I think macroeconomic policy has a big role to play in keeping labor markets tight. And I think we're seeing that now in terms of wage growth differentials are compressing, so people at the lowest wage levels are able to see the fastest wage gains. We've seen that the employment rate differentials between black and white persons has actually narrowed considerably to all-time lows. And I expect, as we did over the latter half of the 2010s, the differential in employment rates between those who have a college degree and those who only have a high school diploma will also narrow. That said, this rapid pace of this recovery, it's been so uncharacteristically rapid that the byproduct of that is we've seen some of these challenges constraining job growth become more visible. It's everything from microchips to ports to childcare. And so institutions that had grown accustomed to slack labor markets, slow jobless recoveries have been caught off sides by the pace of the current recovery. Sources of underinvestment have been exposed. The challenges of today can only be tackled through persistent investments in greater capacity and greater resilience. That is as true for bottlenecked sectors like automobiles and logistics as it is for people who are not able to be fully employed due to the lack of access to affordable childcare. If we settle for a shallow recovery from here, businesses will continue to underinvest and fewer people will be able to participate in the benefits of a growing economy. As a final note, while I have referenced the importance of achieving a full recovery in the PER from the pandemic, that should not be the ceiling of our ambitions. It should disappoint us all that the US is a clear laggard among comparable advanced economies in terms of the prime age employment rate. For a stark example, Quebec has a PER of 7.4 percentage points above the US. A key ingredient to their success has involved raising the employment rates of women through the availability of universal childcare. If the US is looking to catch up to the rest of the world on labor market outcomes, it will require ambitious investments and macroeconomic policies that promote and sustain a tight labor market. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir, very much. Next, hear from Mr. Swenson Klatt.
Chairman Beyer, Senator Lee, members of the Joint Economic Committee, thank you for the opportunity to be with you today and share my experience as a small business owner, representing Main Street Alliance, a national network of small businesses. I'd also like to acknowledge that my home state senator, Senator Klobuchar, has been a long and steadfast supporter of small business owners, and I really appreciate the work she's done. I have owned and operated Butter Bakery Cafe in Minneapolis for 16 years, partnering with a housing program to provide supportive internships during the last 9. My business has weathered recession, a move to a new location, major road construction, a pandemic, civil disruptions, and still we're open. I think of that as a major accomplishment, but also a testament to my staff, my community support, and indeed to government support through the SBA. Just maintaining an 18-person crew is a full-time hat that I wear. We had 21 employees before the pandemic and dropped to a low of 12. Next week, number 19 will be back on staff. I attract workers by offering a full wage, a fair wage, a healthy workplace, and a mission to serve our community. By choosing to offer a full wage to staff who customarily would rely on an unstable system of tipping, I get workers who invest in my business and currently have 5 with over 5 years. We build a culture that reinforces stability, and that model helps me. I spend less time on hiring, training, filling gaps in the schedule. It's good business, and it's been working. However, during the past year and a half, finding, retaining staff, indeed the very model of my business, has been turned upside down. I've needed 38 people over the past 18 months to fill my workforce. They come and go. Many of the staffing obstacles small business owners have always struggled with have grown to a point of serious harm to our businesses. Where in the past I could use a few $100s out of my pocket to get around a barrier for a staff member, the size and scope has exceeded my capacity. Without government support, I would have closed. Sadly, I know friends who did, who own businesses and did not have that support. My small business is still struggling, and as I look to recover, rebuild, and yes, even to grow, I'm in a tough position. I do have working capital on hand, but it's in the form of a large debt. If used well, it might be able to be paid off through growth in my business, but right now, I'm still worried. We're facing challenges that are very different from the past. And I worry that current trends may not shift without some strategic investments in workplace supports from our government at all levels. And frankly, you have bigger pockets than me. My applicant pool is limited in a number of factors, including lack of affordable, high-quality childcare. I need a level playing field so employees with children can reach and afford childcare and get to a center or a childcare program. Currently, my employees with children can only work limited hours. Access to affordable housing. While hundreds of new apartment buildings and units are going up around my cafe, only a tiny fraction are options that serve my workforce and the workforce of small business owners. Reliable, affordable transit would help. I do have to rely on transportation coming through for staff who don't walk to work, and I struggle more times than I admit with transportation options that fall through. A comprehensive paid leave program would be a way for my staff to take time off for health and personal reasons that doesn't put my business or their job at jeopardy. I am willing to contribute my part as an employer, just like I do for supporting sick staff, the unemployed, an injured or retired worker. The constraints of a small business budget do not allow me, though, to personally pay to begin a family or take care of a health crisis or find a safe place. Childcare, transit, housing, paid leave, they're just a few of the pieces, and there are so many more hats I have to wear to take care of my staff. And with so many challenges resulting from this pandemic, bold, compassionate investments from our government will give me and my staff the hope and support we need to go to work, to get back to business, to grow again. Thank you for the chance to share my story, and I am happy to answer your questions today.
Thank you, Mr. Swenson-Klatt. And finally, Ms. Gressler, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to testify. Today's labor market is unlike anything that we have ever experienced before in America, and certainly it's nothing that was predicted at the start of the pandemic. Wages are rising, and there's been a giant leap forward in family-friendly policies and workplace flexibility, and yet employers are struggling with this severe labor shortage. There were 10.4 million job openings in August, even as 4.3 million workers voluntarily quit their jobs. Add to that an increasing number of employers who are being forced to fire workers that they desperately need because of an unauthorized federal vaccine mandate, and we're at a gap of about 6 million jobs before what we had the trend prior to the pandemic. That's contributed to shortages of goods and services, longer waits, and higher costs. The solution to increasing employment is twofold. It needs to pay to work, and it can't pay to not work. The problem today is the latter. Government policies have made it so that it simply isn't worth it to work for some people. 18 months of unemployment benefits that paid people more to be unemployed than to work contributed to this drag on employment. States that ended those benefits early have experienced much faster recoveries, and an estimate shows that had the states that didn't end the benefits early otherwise done so, they would have gained 800,000 more jobs in July and August alone. Then there's been massive expansions in Obamacare subsidies, food stamps, and other welfare benefits that have made it possible for some individuals and families to be better off not working. This massive $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill will double down on employment losses by creating welfare without work programs that discourage people from taking jobs and at the same time raise taxes and micromanage employers so that they're less likely to create jobs. The Texas Public Policy Foundation estimated that this bill would reduce employment by 5.3 million, while Casey Mulligan estimated it would cost 8.7 million jobs. Most of those losses would come from expanded Obamacare subsidies and also the monthly child payments that eliminate work requirements. A study by University of Chicago economists found that those monthly child payments would cause 1.5 million parents to drop out of the labor force. That's particularly troubling when you consider that those losses would disproportionately fall on lower income and single-parent families where work is an essential component to breaking cycles of poverty. Unpublished data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics suggests that this could already be happening. When the pandemic first began, parents actually experienced fewer employment losses. But since the late spring of this year, coinciding with the start of the monthly child payments, that trend actually reversed and parents' employment declined. Some have pointed to childcare struggles, especially when arguing for massive new childcare entitlement that would disproportionately benefit high-income families and be out of reach to families that prefer faith-based or family-based childcare. But a May 2021 study by Jason Furman, former chair of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, found that childcare struggles were causing zero impact on parents' employment. That was May 2021. And there's simply no explanation for why, since that point, a year after the pandemic, childcare struggles would now be causing this big drag. In addition to discouraging work, the big government tax and spend package would micromanage employers, limit workplace flexibility, and exacerbate supply shortages and cost increases. For example, just as workers' access to paid family leave has increased 64% over the past 5 years, politicians want to replace those flexible and accommodating policies with a one-size-fits-all government-controlled one. And then there's a push to ramp up fines on employers and force more workers into unions. The debacle at the ports in Southern California shows what happens when unions refuse to increase operations and when environmental and labor restrictions prevent 80% of trucks in the nation from entering the state, and when government regulations limit how, who, and where people can work. And now, as many Californians are fleeing the state, the reconciliation package seeks to impose California's failed policies on the rest of the nation. Command economy tactics and cradle-to-grave welfare programs won't help Americans thrive because individuals, families, and employers are far better than politicians at making decisions that impact their everyday lives and those around them. When President Clinton signed the historic welfare reform in 1996, he quoted Robert Kennedy, who said, "Work is the meaning of what this country is all about. We need it as individuals. We need to sense it in our fellow citizens, and we need it as a society and as a people." Politicians can help empower Americans to succeed by allowing them to keep more of their earnings, by reducing regulations, by allowing more flexible job opportunities and more accommodating benefit options, by expanding educational choices, and by trying to help get people off of welfare instead of anchoring them to it. Thank you.
Mr. Gressler, thank you very much, and thank all of you for your testimony. We now begin a round of questions. I'll begin. I'm reading Rick Atkinson's new book on the Revolutionary War, where I discovered that George Washington, as the first general of the Continental Army, required smallpox vaccinations for all the troops. A lot of history there. I'll point out that the 1 million people in America have already died from COVID-19. And it's not just about your personal desire to risk death. It's about the significant likelihood that you will cause the illness or death of others. We certainly wouldn't want people with very contagious polio or leprosy or smallpox wandering through our businesses and our populations. Dr. Stevenson, I'm concerned, but Ms. Gressler talked about the states that eliminated those benefits early had faster growth than those that didn't. I'd read studies in both the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times that pointed exactly the opposite. Can you, as former chief economists of Labor Department, comment on that?
I have seen a number of studies that found that there was no effect at all from ending those unemployment benefits early in terms of increasing employment. And that's what economists, market-based economists, found at places like Goldman Sachs and other, I would say, market economists who have an incentive to go where the truth is. I've also seen academic economists like Aaron Dubé, who did very deep analysis and found no real effect. The biggest criticism I've heard of on these studies is that when the states ended those unemployment insurance benefits early, they also saw a rise in COVID cases from the Delta variant, and whether that's clouding any ability to do the analysis, I'm not sure if that's what Casey Mulligan was trying to account for to get the results that you just heard. But there's a wide range of studies that do find the exact opposite, that we saw ending the unemployment benefits early did not send people back to work.
I just note that Virginia kept the benefits and has an unemployment rate 0.9% below the national average. Mr. Swenson-Klott, you had talked about the baker who had 1 week of leave added up, and you paid the rest of it, the other 2 weeks, and actually deferred your own salary. How many small business people do you think can pay this out of their profits or defer their own salaries to keep their people doing that?
Thank you. And before the pandemic, those kind of opportunities were really pretty hit and miss. Whether the bakery was ready, had some cash flow, whether I could feel like I could give away a couple months of time. There are plenty of times I never did that for staff who needed the time away, who we just didn't have the cash to do it. And it's more the story that I hear from other employers that they just wouldn't have paid that. It wasn't available to them. We don't have that kind of cash flow. When the pandemic assistance came, all of a sudden I found I had a way to pay people to be away. And that was just an amazing gift for me as a business owner and for my staff.
Thank you. Dr. Stevenson, how do you feel about the adding the work requirements? And what's the evidence about work requirements and its impact on these families that need the help?
So the amount of money in the child tax credit is terrific for reducing poverty, but not enough to replace a salary, or wages. And this is why I don't think that the evidence is very strong that it would lead people to not work. Let me be clear, I very much support increasing financial support for childcare. Putting a work requirement on the child tax credit is turning it into a child care credit for single parents because you're requiring them to work and incur costs regarding child care. I find it very difficult to put together the arguments that want to allow families to be able to make the right choice for them about when they provide care for their own children and when they're in the workforce with the idea of putting a work requirement on the child tax credit. The point of the child tax credit is to ensure that children don't grow up in poverty, and we shouldn't be requiring that everybody in the household work. I also just have to point out that there is a very disturbing inequality with a work requirement on a child tax credit, and that my understanding is the way it would be implemented is at the household level. So you would be requiring that a single mother works, but would not be requiring that a married mother works. And that is a gross inequity that we should not allow.
Thank you, Dr. Stevenson, very much. Let me now defer to the senator from Utah for his questions. Senator Lee?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Gressler, I'd like to start with you, if that's all right. Work is something of a foundational component of living a happy, healthy, productive life. Research from our team here at the Joint Economic Committee's Social Capital Project has shown that being out of the labor force is not only associated with less income, but also poorer social outcomes, more physical ailments, and worse emotional well-being. Given the benefits associated with work, I think encouraging work is important, and discouraging it should be avoided. Dr. William McBride, a witness at our previous hearing, noted in his research for the Tax Foundation that tax hikes in the Build Back Better Act would cost Americans more than 300,000 jobs. This plan would also remove work incentives in the child tax credit and the dependent care credit. For mothers and fathers who already have weak ties to the labor market, for them in particular, how will they be affected by removing these requirements? And rather than giving up on work as the primary way to increase living standards, are there other policies that you would suggest to increase these opportunities for Americans?
Yeah, so the massive reconciliation package has multiple ways in which it discourages work, primarily by making work not pay, especially for people who are at the margin, and that's at the lower end of the income scale. My colleague Robert Rector estimated that this proposal would add about $8,500 in new benefits to a family that's already receiving about $36,000 worth of cash, food, and housing benefits. That's not even counting the health care. And so you're creating a situation where individuals can be better off not working. And yet we've seen that historically breaking cycles of poverty means you need to have an example of work in the home. If you have a two-parent home, then yes, one worker could be working and one could be staying home with the child. If it's a single parent, there needs to be that example of work there. And in terms of increasing employment, increasing the incentive to work, and helping to have more of that in the economy, there are many ways that you could do that. One of them that I think is particularly fruitful during this time, and I'm looking at women in particular, is more opportunities for flexible work. Freelancing work, independent work, so that it doesn't have to be the 9-to-5 job where you have to report to the boss and you have to check in and sit at your desk, but things that I've seen so many women, my friends included, that they're able to do, whether it's in the morning or at night, and still be able to care for children. We shouldn't be closing doors to opportunities, and that's what's in this proposal in many ways, including forcing people into those unionized one-size-fits-all jobs.
Right. So in many instances, you actually have federal law and federal regulations based on federal law serving as a restriction on those things. And reforms like the Working Families Flexibility Act, which would allow America's moms and dads to make decisions that better reflect their own needs, would help this problem in the same way that this legislation would make it worse.
Absolutely, and your Working Families Flexibility Act is one of the best ways because it's particularly geared for those lower income hourly workers. And all it does is give them an option. If you want to work 2 extra hours this week so that you can take 3 hours off next week, that's a choice. Nobody's forcing it. It should absolutely be done to help increase that access to paid family leave.
Now, last month's disappointing jobs growth report underscores the uncertainty associated with our slowly recovering economy. And at the same time, employers across the country are increasingly desperate to find qualified and willing workers who are able to fill, more than 10 million open jobs. President Biden's vaccine mandate, from my perspective, not only will, but is already making things worse, which is odd because it doesn't even exist yet. He hasn't had the decency to share it with us, so it can't be challenged in court, can't be scrutinized, but people are following it because the in terrorem effect of these anticipated daily civil monetary penalties of like $70,000 per worker per day per violation is causing a lot of corporate America to just say, we're going to try to guess what it is so we're not caught flat-footed. And I've heard from employers across Utah say that they may have to fire as much as 20% of their workforce. So The vaccine mandate is just one more example of Washington getting in the way of the recovery. And so if the president doesn't reverse course, what will be the effect of these policies on Americans' conditions as they approach work?
And it's not just the loss in jobs. We're also talking about a loss in the safety and the health and education, because these are the people who are being impacted most. New York City had to lay off thousands of school workers. They've had to lay off thousands of healthcare workers, shut down maternity wards. My sister lives in New York, and she had one of her young children who had to have an operation, and she was told to travel 170 miles to Pittsburgh because the closer hospital by them was having staff shortages due to the vaccine. So this is absolutely impacting Americans, and I think it's very ironic and just wrong that yesterday's heroes are now today's villains and are being fired.
Unacceptable, un-American, unconstitutional, and immoral. Thank you.
I had to point out that I heard last night that we have 1,042 Virginia children who have been hospitalized with COVID, and 2 died 2 days ago. Senator Heinrich, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman. And let me start by just saying how grateful I am to have had the college degree that my father's one-size-fits-all union job made possible. I want to talk about New Mexico and child care. In New Mexico, the cost of 2 children in child care is about $18,000 a year. That's a lot less than a lot of other places, I will give you. The Build Back Better plan would limit out-of-pocket expenses for child care to 7% of a family's income, and I know full well what that would mean for my constituents. But Mr. Ammernath, I want to ask you to tell me what it would mean, how that could impact the prime age employment rate, and also why that's important.
Yeah, so your question really helps to highlight an area where the U.S. has been lagging for such a long time relative to other advanced economies. So we talk about childcare being accessible and affordable. If we look at those countries that have actually made a real concerted effort to make sure that it's affordable and accessible, and if that means subsidizing the wages of workers in childcare to make that possible, employment rates are much higher. And as Dr. Stevenson also pointed out, prime age employment rate, which adjusts for aging. Yes, people are aging into their retirement ages, or they may be going to school if they're younger, but for that 25 to 54-year-old cohort, we're talking about employment rates that are, in the US, much lower than most other advanced economies. And we should really be asking why that is, and what's the constraint, and what led other countries to raise ahead. And a big part of that, I would argue, is female employment rates have been able to rise because not all work has to be done within the household, that you actually are able to have that flexibility, that childcare is not so punitively expensive on the market that you have to effectively be at home. And I said, if we can take a very stark example of this, even with north of the border, Canada's higher employment rates has continued to see higher employment rates, and in a province like Quebec, which is not really maybe known as much, but is 7% more than the U.S. That's a pretty substantial amount. If we're to say there's 7% decline in the unemployment rate, if you could do something like this, I think we should at least pay closer attention to this issue.
Yeah, it seems like one of the things we all agree on, actually, which is surprising that we can all agree on something, is that we'd like to see more participation in the labor force. Dr. Stevenson, do work requirements actually get us to that goal? And what would the impact of a one-size-fits-all work requirement, say for the child tax credit, to be able to get that mean for grandparents who are the primary caregivers and who have custody of their grandchildren, which is a very common situation in the state of New Mexico?
So I think that it's not going to put people back in jobs. What it's going to do is remove cash from the household. When you remove cash from the household, you end up hurting kids, and you end up reducing labor force participation of those kids as they grow up. So you actually can end up ultimately having a negative effect by putting a work requirement on. I think that it's really important to think hard about how people choose when and where to work. We've heard a lot about how, a vaccine mandate may lead some people to leave a job because they don't want to get vaccinated. It's really important to focus on the number of people who are not in jobs right now because they are afraid of getting COVID and afraid of unvaccinated colleagues. I want to bring that up because you mentioned grandparents, and what we saw was a large decline in labor force participation among older workers, an increase in retirement. We're not going to be able to push these older workers who are fearful of getting sick and potentially dying from COVID back into the labor force by putting a work requirement on a child tax credit. What we can do is help households make ends meet so that they can then think about how to better participate in the labor force. You know, one of the things we're seeing right now with all those quits is people are going into better jobs that I think they'll be able to stick in for longer. And that will ultimately also lead to higher labor force participation. So getting people not just into any old job, but into a job that pays a living wage that they feel valued in, that they can stick in, allows them to stay for 5 years like we've heard that people do when they're in a good job.
Mr. Chairman, in the interests of facilitating other members of the panel, I'm going to give the rest of my time back.
Thank you, Senator, very much. Now I'd like to recognize my friend from Arizona, Representative Swanker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, I've shared with you a little bit of my frustration, having been on joint economic for a long time. We can do better on the intellectual credibility of what's being handed to us. We're better than much of this testimony. Just for the record, I thought I might hand you the Federal Reserve St. Louis study from about a couple weeks ago that actually does show the employment differentials of states that did cut back or end their extended spiff on unemployment, and the numbers are actually fairly dramatic. I want to talk about this one before I ask to hand it into the record, because you mentioned it in your opening testimony. We have also the big study, which actually I found fascinating, from the 4 economists, PhDs at University of Chicago. And I have an absolute fixation on labor force participation numbers. Why was there such an economic miracle in 18 and 19, particularly being from the desert Southwest? You know, my numbers for Hispanic females were remarkable. Wage growth was remarkable without all the social engineering that is part of the package. So what happened? Why did it work? And then this University of Chicago study that sort of walks through saying, you know, there's a line here, the decline in employment and consequent earning loss means that child poverty would fall about 22%, but for severe poverty, it doesn't fall at all. So stunning amounts of money and the design of the program that's being promoted doesn't actually help the very people we care about. Maybe it's time we intellectually step up our game and start thinking about what works and what doesn't work, not just the folklore of that's the Republican idea, that's the Democrat idea, and actually think about, do we actually give a damn about helping people? Because academic paper after academic paper says, yeah, you get some effect, but for the people you most care about, it doesn't work. You actually talked about the paper. Why doesn't it work? And what do you think we should do that's different that actually would reflect the success, particularly we're having in 2019?
Yes, when we saw in the paper there, you quoted that the deep childhood poverty, that it would have no impact on that, and yet we're considering increasing these monthly payments up to $1,000, $1,600 per year. That doesn't make sense. So what that says is at the furthest low end of the income scale, those are the people who are gonna lose that work connection. And that's where it's most important, because we know that that is what is crucial to breaking those cycles of poverty. You can't make a situation where a family is just as well off or better off by not working than by working. And so you absolutely have to have those incentives in there, and it can't be government micromanaged. Here's government job training, here's government paid family leave, here's government childcare. We saw that what happened after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that included tax cuts on corporations, they fed it through to their workers. Some of those companies went out and they pulled their workers. What do you want? Do you want higher wages? Do you want more compensation? A lot of the time we want paid family leave. That's why we saw a 64% increase in paid family leave. We saw a $1,400 above trend wage growth in the period after that because those tax cuts fed through and they resulted in workers having higher incomes. And they also just gave more opportunities out there. Employers were willing to invest in their workers with job training programs. And the opposite is occurring here because you're going to take away from the people who are creating jobs and redistribute it in ways that discourage people from taking jobs.
Look, we have lots of good data, and it's real math of the miracle numbers. I mean, it was the Goldilocks economy. It demonstrating, once again, supply side does actually work. Great wealth effects, closing of income inequality, minority population seeing wage growth and employment growth. And I despise storytelling, but I'm going to actually break my own rule. Great experience. Homeless community in Phoenix. We actually do a combined homeless shelter, helped work on it for years ago. St. Joseph the Worker actually had this explosion of people begging, saying, we're willing to take a chance. Send us homeless people because we're so desperate for workers. So it's somewhat where it was said over here, if you can make labor valuable. Almost every one of these proposals being offered by the left devalues labor. And Mr. Chairman, that's my great fear is we both care. My fear is, though, the left proposals are going to make things much worse. And with that, I yield back and would like, but also before UC to hand the documents to the record.
With that objection, those documents are accepted. And I would suggest that we be careful about devaluing any of the experts' testimony because there are contradictory studies. There may be one from the Fed. There are also those from the University of Chicago, from JP Morgan, from AP, and others that claim the UI benefits did not create slower.
Actually, Mr. Chairman, knowing two of the studies, they were actually before about half these states had actually begun their rollback.
Let me also point out that claiming that the CTC does not work at all for those in extreme poverty, not working at all is different from being insufficient to lift them out above poverty. It's hard to imagine that $250 and $300 per child has
Mr.
no
Chairman,
effect at all.
once again, it's the quote from the study. It's not my quote.
Thank you. Let me now recognize Mr. Peters from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to spend a lot of time on unemployment supplements. You know, we knew we overshot. The risk we took was we were overshooting in order to avoid economic disaster. So if we ended up paying unemployment benefits for a little too long, it may have suppressed employment at some point, and I think that's good for next time. But that's over with. So that's retrospective, and we're not talking about extending those right now. So I put that to bed. The other thing about vaccines is, sure, I think probably we've heard want to get vaccinated. On the other hand, in the face of a pandemic where 1 million people have died, the workforce is not the only public policy we have to be concerned about. We have to be concerned about actually protecting each other. And so I don't think that rolling back the vaccine mandate is the proper way to get at the worker shortage that we're facing right now. I don't think that's the right strategy. One strategy you didn't mention that I'm curious about, and I asked this for Dr. Amarnath, the role of the immigrant workforce when it comes to our labor shortage. I mean, one idea about getting more laborers is actually to bring more in, and that's what we've done traditionally. Would that be a good solution, and what would that do to economic growth in general?
Okay, I think it's a sort of direct matter, immigration leading to higher labor force growth, and thus sort of somewhat mechanically leading to higher output growth is obviously there. There are areas where we have sort of identifiable labor shortages and not just sort of anecdotes in terms of manufacturing and construction where you can point to the extent we can bring people, especially those who have actually been working here and done a lot of the essential work, that obviously would be beneficial to be able to create a more robust workforce.
Maybe let Dr. Stevenson, would you comment on that as well, the role of immigration? Your microphone.
I do believe that we are seeing some labor market problems that come from the fact that we have not had as many foreign workers come in to the country. At the risk of enraging some of you, I will give you a story, which is at the University of Michigan. We don't have a lot of foreign students on campus, and we definitely see the places where the foreign students used to work are having problems hiring people. There's certainly industries that rely on foreign workers that are having a hard time finding people. I think it would be really valuable to be thinking in the context of immigration reform, looking very closely at this question of how immigrants support the U.S. labor market and support growth, because this has certainly been a time with closed borders and limited foreign workers.
Let me ask you about your testimony about economic recovery and employment stability. In my district in San Diego, we rely a lot on tourism and hospitality. It's a significant part of our economy. What would you say about tourism and hospitality? What could employers do to increase stability in their workforce when these jobs don't always come with benefits and other incentives?
I mean, the first thing to say is these jobs have become much riskier. These were not risky jobs. In fact, when I was a kid, a college student, a young person in my 20s, these were fun jobs. They're now jobs where, first of all, just the level of animosity in the way people are treating each other is making these jobs less fun, and the fact that you have to ask people to put their mask on has made them less fun. That's also pointing to the need for these jobs to just pay a living wage. You know, we really need stability in, you know, our work, and that means being able to be not rely on a job which may lay you off tomorrow. And that's actually one of the real things that's still going on in leisure and hospitality. There are a lot of workers who are still at risk and will lose their job potentially tomorrow, could be losing their job right now as we speak, because the pandemic, as it goes on, is causing some of the tourist industry is struggling to keep afloat. And that's, you know, the biggest way we'll get the tourism industry back on track is to vaccinate more of the population. My kids would like to go to Disney World again. We're not there yet as a country, in my perspective, and I think that that's why we don't have as many workers back there. I think that's incredibly important, that these jobs become more stable, they pay better, and that we find a way to make them safer than they are right now.
Let me just ask you one more question about the child tax credit. The idea of a child tax credit to provide additional funds for families that have children. Doesn't that address the ability of parent choice? Because I guess if you get money for a child, you can decide to use that income to stay home, or you can decide to deploy that money to childcare if childcare exists. In terms of choosing policies, isn't that really the most efficient economically sound program?
To be clear, there is no work disincentive from the child tax credit, because if there's no work requirement on it, if the parents can get access to this money and they have the choice then of what they're going to do. If we put a work requirement on it, then you're effectively saying, I'm going to give you money to pay the additional costs of you going to work. If you don't put the work requirement on it, you're letting parents choose what's right for their family.
Right. I think parent choice is something we all would like to support. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Peters. Let me recognize now Congressman from Kansas, Mr. Estes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all our witnesses for being here today. You know, without enough workers, Americans across the country will continue to experience rising prices, longer wait times, and shortages. The Kansans I represent are rightfully alarmed about the direction of the economy. You know, inflation levels are at a level not seen for 30 years, and businesses are unable to find enough workers. Instead of searching for solutions to make hiring easier, the Biden administration has decided to implement a series of policies that create barriers and make it harder for businesses to find workers. They've even gone so far as to force businesses to fire workers for reasons unrelated to their work due to the recent OSHA mandate. It's clear that the vaccine mandate will lead to serious disruptions across the U.S. economy. That's because it's both unreasonable and unaccommodating. There's a recent Washington Post poll that found 72% of unvaccinated Americans would quit their jobs if their employers forced them to get the vaccine without the opportunity for exemptions. The mandate will surely lead to more worker shortages across the country, both within critical supply chains and within the healthcare industry. Administration has estimated that their mandate will apply to 2/3 of the workforce. Just this week, the American Trucking Association warned the White House that in response to the vaccine mandate, many drivers will likely quit. But there's already 80,000 worker shortages in the trucking industry today, and forcing more workers to quit in a time when we desperately need them is not the right approach. I think it's important to point out that not only is President Biden's order unconstitutional, it does not contribute to building a stronger healthcare industry. We're seeing hospitals that are already dealing with staffing shortages now unable to staff beds as part of the result of Biden's mandate. One hospital, of course, as we've all talked about, has been forced to put baby deliveries on hold after maternity workers quit in protest to the mandate. The reduction in healthcare workforces caused by the mandates dramatically lowered capacity to respond to COVID, as well as other infectious diseases and high-risk events like heart attacks and strokes. The solution to fix the current record high gap between the number of job openings and number of unemployed workers, is not more taxpayer-funded programs, but policies that finding workers make it easier for industries. Ms. Kressler, President Biden's so-called Build Back Better Act would lead to greater upward pressure on prices and further disincentivize able-bodied adults to work. If passed, how much would the Build Back Better Act accelerate both inflation and labor market crisis we're currently experiencing, and how bad could microeconomic conditions become?
Well, we've heard some estimates in terms of the potential employment and job losses in the 5 to 8 million range, and we really don't know what's going to happen to inflation, and there are a lot of factors at play there, but certainly Americans have experienced the impact of employers not being able to fill their positions, and that leading to higher prices at the grocery store, at the gas station, on pretty much everything that we're purchasing, and also support shortages, not even being able to get certain things. And then in looking at the Build Back Better Act and just all the rules that it's going to put on employers, micromanaging everything, I mean, when you look over that, it just makes it so difficult. You wonder, why would anybody even want to create jobs, and why would they want to run a business and provide that income and that opportunity to individuals when the government is going to be the one that's going to tell them when their workers can have access to paid family leave. They're going to tell them whether or not they have to join a union, and therefore breaking that ability for the employee and the employer to work together. That particularly concerns me among women who like to have greater flexibility in the workplace, and they might not want the rules that the union is negotiating. Or now, being an employer, you're going to have to automatically enroll workers in a retirement account, even if you don't have one set up for them yet. And you're just going to have all of these mandates piled on top of one another that just creates an enormous burden on employers.
You also pointed out that the Green New Deal would cost every American $1,991 per year over the next decade, or nearly $8,000 per year for a family of 4. Combined with some of these other ongoing proposals, you note that a typical American household would pay about $100,000 over the next decade. So if passed, how does this increasing burden on households affect our economic growth?
Well, it leaves everybody less well off in the end. Less income, less opportunity. And I think that it's easy to sell a $3.5 trillion package as it's going to provide you childcare, it's going to provide you paid family leave, it's going to give you a monthly check, it's going to do all these things for you. But there are two sides to everything. You know, everybody argues about, I want to see the one-handed economist, because, well, actually there's two realities. And what are the costs on the other side of that? And yes, if you just look at some of those things, I added it up, and potentially the typical American household would have $100,000 less purchasing power in the future in order to trade off these things where they're going to get what the government gives them instead of what they could otherwise go out and decide what they wanted to get on their own.
Yeah, you noted something very important there, that the federal government can't give any money away in a program unless it takes it away from a taxpayer to begin with.
And I think that's very important to think about here, is we've heard, you know, your pockets are deeper than my pockets. Your pockets are reaching into the pockets of every American and every business owner in order to take money out of them to give it back to somebody else. We're not just talking about money that's growing off of trees here. Even if it's monthly child payments, that money has to come out of the economy somewhere, and it comes out of the paychecks and the incomes of families who are parents, who do have children. So it's not just all a net gain to be sending money because it's coming from the federal government.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. And I recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Poquet.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. And thanks for all the witnesses for being here. I'm not going to refer to, I guess, studies. I'm going to do it from practical experience. I'm a almost 34-year owner of a small business. Started it when I had hair. I was 23 years old. It's been a while back. And I talk to a lot of small business people because those are the people I've known for most of my adult life. There's one of my largest employers in my district is in California and Wisconsin. He has 6,000 employees. He told me recently he was up to 70% a little while back on vaccination rate. An employee came in with COVID. And he decided he was going to change that. So he did all sorts of initiatives, got up to over 99%. And finally, at the end, had to fire 40 people out of 6,000. That's about 2/3 of 1%. So those studies that say 20% of people will be fired for not doing mandates, I'm just telling you, the people I talk to in Wisconsin don't necessarily have that study, but they have the practical experience of that not being real. I just thought I'd mention that. I also belong to 3 chambers of commerce. very active in a number of business issues. We had the SBA administrator in Wisconsin a few months back, and I invited all the different business groups to have a meeting with her. And my largest chamber, the Madison Chamber of Commerce, Madison's about 250,000 people, they and the Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, which is one of the most conservative business groups who I also invited in my state, said they just did a survey of members, and the head of the chamber said that the number one issue blocking people going to employment was childcare. And one of the initiatives that we're trying to do, and I think is going to be in the Build Back Better agenda, is this childcare initiative to reduce it to 7%. And much like Mr. Swenson, Claude, as a small business person, I've got someone starting Monday as well. That'll bring us back to full complement pre-COVID. But their childcare they just got is costly quite a bit by the percent, and this would be a game changer. Dr. Stevenson, just from that practical thing, you're going to give me maybe the scientific side of it. I'm going to give you the practical side. If I'm being told by employers in my area that the number one barrier to getting people hired right now, and we certainly all have that experience, is childcare, can you just talk a drop more about how important that initiative of a 7% of your income covering childcare would mean?
I mean, it's a practical reality that you cannot pay more for childcare than you are being paid for your own job. That's just a limit that people have. Childcare is more expensive than college for many families, and yet we spend a lot of time wondering how families are going to pay for college and college tuition, and we leave them on their own, particularly when they're younger, with lower incomes than they might have when their kids are old enough for college, and we tell them to figure childcare out on their own. A lot of parents simply can't do it. They try to cobble together plans. They might use a network of relatives or neighbors and some amount of paid childcare, but they're running into troubles. We're seeing upward pressure on wages at the bottom end of the income distribution. This is actually a good thing. This means that many people who are our lowest wage workers are going to be earning a living wage. But childcare providers are struggling because if they pay more than $12 an hour to keep up with what Amazon warehouse is paying, what Starbucks is paying, they got to pass those costs on to parents who are themselves not earning much more than the childcare workers themselves. That's going to cause, as childcare workers' wages will go up whether you do something or not, because wages at the bottom are going up. As those wages go up, people will drop out of the labor force because they are unable to pay for that childcare. That's the reality. You need to step in and try to support that. And just one other thing to add to that is the research does show that every dollar we invest in young children comes back to the taxpayer in terms of $7 to $8 later on. Somebody does have to pay for these costs. It turns out they're paid for by increased productivity of those kids as they grow up.
Thank you. I'll never forget, too, when the Affordable Care Act got in place, I had a child care provider in my district stop me in the grocery store and cry because she finally had health insurance for the first time. So I appreciate that. Mr. Swenson, since you are like me, someone I spent that many years, and I know you spent a long time building your business. You specifically brought up family and medical leave, paid family and medical leave. Can you just talk a bit more about how that would help you both in attracting employees and being able to grow your business?
Thank you. As I mentioned, I'm partnering with a housing program. It is a housing program that houses young adults who've been homeless, 18 to 24-year-olds. And in that population, as we work with them in internship programs, you can tell there's a lot of health disparities at work. So we're the kind of place that's supportive. We create flexible schedules. We do the extra little mile to help someone with a rough day. That's leave time in many cases, a chance for a person to just take care of themselves. Mental health issues are a huge piece of young adult experience right now. If the pandemic isn't a kind of a wake-up call, we should be aware. I have a lot of young adults who work for me for whom it's been a really tough set of years. Mental health issues are really challenging. Sometimes you need that time off. The flexibility that I had during the pandemic to back into a program that was available to pay for people to be away allowed me to just keep open. I wasn't panicking because I knew they were going to keep their job. They were going to come back when they're feeling a little better, back on their feet. We would be flexible as a staff, support each other, and get back to where we needed to be. that kind of predictability for my staff and for me means I can just keep going forward. Before that, it was very hit or miss. And I miss that possibility again. I don't look forward to the days when someone needs a couple weeks and I don't have a way to support them. And in a couple weeks, for the young folks I work with, that's rent, that's food. It's back into the instability.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the extra time.
Thank you very much. I'm going to recognize the gentlewoman from Washington, Mr. Rivera Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to clarify of our last witness, I just want to make sure I understood that correctly. The ability to do the paid family leave and to provide the sick leave or just mental health time for your employees was a result, excuse me, of the payments because of the COVID replacement money, correct?
Yes.
So you weren't able to provide that prior to the pandemic. Okay, thank you. I just wanted to clarify that. Paid family leave, childcare, something I've actually worked on quite a bit here in Congress. I believe we need to find ways to address this issue, whether we like it or not. It's something we do need to address. But I also am challenged because it is also true that money comes from somewhere. And it's not all, I believe in investing in children, but not all investments are the same. People talk about pre-K, and pre-K is important, but the quality of the pre-K is really the thing that makes the difference when you talk about getting $7 back for the $1 in. It's not just warehouse childcare; it's investment in children. So I do want to make sure we're not blanketing that. And I supported the legislation last year strongly to replace really when private companies got shut down because of a public interest. Right, the federal government or the states or whatever shut you down because we were trying to protect people against this pandemic. It was through no fault of your own that you were getting shut down. And so that relief payment to me was similar. I compared it to eminent domain. Like when there's a taking of private property for a public good, there needs to be just recompense. And that's how I view that. As we move forward into policy, we're not in that situation anymore. And I'm all for innovative ideas and solutions that help us get to where a smaller or mid-sized business can compete for that labor force by offering robust benefits. But the Build Back Better plan has frustrated me because it's not innovative or creative. It's just let's tax more and spend more. Well, that doesn't last. And I do think what we saw, I was here during the Obama years and the Trump years, and I remember during Obama years being told we're never going to grow again. Like our economy is never going to grow. We're at I think when he left office, we were at 1.6% GDP growth. And we were told we'll never see a 3% growth again in our economy. Those days are gone. And bam, we cut taxes, much to a lot of people's frustration. And we saw real wages grow among almost every recorded class, right? In fact, higher among people who were new to the workforce, like lower wage workers, minorities. I mean, single mothers saw more money back. So I do think there needs to be a more creative approach than just let's throw more money at it. Having said that, and Ms. Greisler, I'm probably butchering that, and I'm sorry, my mind gets butchered all the time. I wanted to ask about small businesses and their impacts and supply chains. I think in your testimony you talked about union impacts in terms of like supply chains, but what are the things that we can be doing to help businesses on the regulatory end or the supply chain end so that they're not wasting time and money on that and maybe they have more flexibility with their employees? Mm-hmm. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, and that just has to do with breaking down those barriers and getting rid of regulations that are in the way of preventing employers from doing what they would otherwise do, being able to work directly with their employees and to be able to get things moving, getting enough people into the door and in order willing to work to begin with. And if I could just briefly comment on the whole childcare and paid family leave, because I do think that across the board, we want to be helping people who are in need, and we want to be helping them in a way that lifts them up. And absolutely, people should have access to paid family leave, and childcare is very important. But if the goal is to help the people who are in need, then why is there a proposal that's going to use most of the money for paid family leave to pay employers who are already providing it to keep providing it? That's not going to help small businesses because that's going to let those employers otherwise further increase their wages. And if we care about childcare, why do we have a plan that's going to give a couple in DC that makes $340,000 a year $30,000 worth of childcare subsidies. That's not helping anybody enter into the labor force.
Is that helping people in Southwest Washington who maybe
No.
don't make $300,000+ a year, who don't have college degrees, but are still making it work, still need help? You're right, it's diverting assets.
Exactly.
Uncreative. It's like
Let's
one
look
size
at-
fits
Let's
all.
look at the existing funding that's out there for Head Start is one example, $10,000 per year. Why not let families take that to a provider of their choice? And I did just want to briefly challenge this notion about these 8 to 9% returns. That is a tiny boutique study 6 decades ago. And even the author of that study, he said, yes, there's 8 to 9% returns for particularly disadvantaged children. And he said, but you know what hasn't been estimated very well is the return of investment of an parent in a child. He said, if I had to guess, that would be a 30 to 40% return. And so anything, I would say, please don't make us look like Quebec, because yes, they significantly increased the labor force participation of mothers with young children, but they did it at the expense of children and families. They had terrible outcomes in terms of social, mobile abilities, health outcomes, worse parenting outcomes, even higher crime rates when those children were teenagers. That is not something that we want to mimic.
Thank you, my time's expired. I appreciate it, Chairman.
Thank you very much. And I now recognize the Congresswoman from Columbus, Ohio, Ms. Beatty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses today. Sitting here trying to digest and listen to a lot of scientific, practical, somewhat biased opinions as well. We've heard a lot about the Build Back Better and what it will or won't do. And childcare, I do agree with my colleague that we should make an investment in our children. And here's what I know, depending on where you live in this wonderful America, in raising your children, it is about quality childcare. And what I do know is if you can't afford quality childcare to make an investment in it, then most mothers, parents, fathers will put their children before anything else. And then they won't be able to go to work. And if we're talking about the economy and growing the workforce, we've heard a lot about the vaccination, Mr. Chairman. And when people talk about the OSHA ruling of employees who have 100 employees or more in the mask, wearing the mask, it's or be tested every week. And I can tell you a major hospital in my district said it was worth every penny that they had to spend on the test because keeping people healthy allows them to go to work. So if you're not tested and you don't know, we had this in this very chambers, people touting that they weren't going to wear a mask, they weren't getting vaccinated. Some of those same people then tested positive and affected other people. And then what I do know is if you miss 10 or 14 days of work on some jobs, you'll lose your job. Here's the other thing I know. For us to talk about the economy and talk about vaccination and not wearing a mask or thinking that the president shouldn't be agreeing with this rule, let me remind you, I went out there to the National Cemetery. 700,000 people have died because of COVID-19. You want to talk about the economy and talk about whether we should wear a mask or be tested? 700,000 people have died. We want to talk about looking like Quebec and what we're going to do, and we come in this hearing and question and challenge the difference between being tested or wearing a mask and what it does? Clearly, you know I have some feelings about that. Whether practical or scientific, people are dying. Thank goodness we have an OSHA ruling that says wear a mask or be tested. So we know that as we talk about the Build Back Better plan, which I think is bold, I think it is visionary, and I think it's going to make a difference in how we grow the economy, how we balance an investment in our communities and in our in our nation. We talk about the economy. So let me go to a question. Mr. And is it Skanda Amarmath?
Yes, Skanda.
Okay. And also Dr. Stevenson. I have a question, and I'll start with you, Mr. Marmuth. In your testimony, you focused on the benefits of tight labor markets and how that can have an effect on witnesses. I wanted to ask you about the impact of a tight labor market and what it would have on the racial gap in the unemployment rate. Historically, we know that Black Americans' unemployment rate is double the unemployment rate of our white Americans. How do you think, or what do you think about the tight labor market's effect on the racial gap in unemployment, and what policies can break this cycle?
Thank you. So the gap between unemployment rates and the gap between called employment rates, employment to population ratios, white persons to Black persons. There's been sort of a complacency systematically to say, oh, the gap is structural in a way that we can't influence through just ordinary fiscal policy, monetary policy, just whatever Congress can do. There has to be some sort of secret trick to unlocking that. But actually, as we find, this is a very cyclical process. So as you get the unemployment rate lower, as you get the employment rates higher, it actually benefits most particularly those who are on the who have been sort of systematically and structurally marginalized. And so we see that Black employment rates rise relative to white employment rates. We've actually seen that they're getting closer and closer in terms of the Black employment to population ratio and the white employment to population ratio. And we have to, if we really want these gaps to converge, we're gonna have to keep investing and keep sort of taking an affirmative approach to making sure we're growing the economy and bringing in those people who tend to be the first ones laid off during recessions, kind of cruelly marginalized and only brought back very slowly typically. So I think it's important for us to keep this recovery going as fast as we can so we can bring back those people.
Thank you, and my time is up, but thank you because I think that also supports the Build Back Better plan. And Ms. Stevenson, I just want to say thank you for allowing us to take a look at the challenges that we're having in childcare. And I certainly agree with you that it will have an impact on our employment. Thank you, and I yield back.
And Ms. Beatty, if you care to stay for a second round, we'll probably pursue that in another 10 minutes. And now let me recognize the distinguished senator from Arizona, Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Amarnath, thank you for testifying here today. Thank you to all of you for being here. A few months ago, I helped to craft the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which passed the Senate in August, and hope to see it pass the House soon. This is a good bill. Makes historic investments in our nation's critical infrastructure, improving our roads, bridges, drinking water, ports of entry, and other things. All of these investments are going to create millions of good-paying jobs. Many of them require high skills. Many of them are technical. We need to make sure that people have these skills to fill these jobs, especially since, as we've heard today, there are jobs already waiting to be filled. Could you talk about the benefit of investing in training programs to ensure workers have the skills they need to fill newly created jobs, and how to best utilize these programs to help with the skills mismatch that we're facing right now?
Thank you. So I think the investments in workforce training, especially in this increasingly tighter labor market, are especially essential because these are in industries that had a very long period of, call it, very cool, underinvested period. Think about construction, for example, as being an area where construction jobs were abundant probably before the Great Recession, and then we had a sort of long decade in which we did not see the sort of requisite employment and investment. And so now we are faced with sort of persistent shortages in construction, manufacturing, maintenance jobs. And these are areas of blue-collar work that is also being, we have sort of some level of persistent investment to be able to ensure we have a workforce that's stable and able to actually address the challenges of an economy that is recovering, and there obviously are sort of growing pains right now. We see supply chain problems, logistics bottlenecks, and part of the challenge here is we need to sort of rise to the occasion of being able to bring in a record amount of goods through our ports, be able to produce a record amount of goods within the U.S. economy itself. And so I think that's going to be critical to have that force to make sure that we have the capacity going forward, and that the growing pains we see now are not the growing pains we're going to see over subsequent years. And we actually do have the capacity. We do have the workforce that's tailored to meeting the material needs of our citizenry.
How do we build that capacity?
I think that part of it has to be a combination of identifying those areas of, especially I think in construction manufacturing, most instructive, where we do see both evidence. People talk about job openings. We're also seeing wage growth has also picked up in those areas. We've also seen that there is an attempt to at least hire aggressively, but it's not necessarily easy to hire people who have oftentimes moved to other sectors over time, and we need to draw them back in. And the training costs especially are costs that if we can burden share on that, especially between the government and the private sector, it would actually be beneficial to both sides, ultimately, to be able to have a trained workforce. In the end, these are very specified skills for these industries, and it's not necessarily the case that if we kind of let a big recession and not even try to attempt to have a strong recovery, those jobs won't be in demand to the same degree. And that's part of the reason we got to this point where we do have labor shortages, is that we have kind of systematically not taken as affirmative and a set of ambitions around sort of fiscal policy and especially around infrastructure investment.
Do you think we can, assuming we get this legislation passed, get programs funded, we're poised to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on critical infrastructure, do you think we could build the workforce we need to complete these projects?
I think so. I think it's a worthwhile investment, especially when you hear this not just from people who want to work, and there are a lot of businesses in these sectors who now see a very clear need to hire, and there obviously are frictions. That's an area where government can do a lot of good for both sides.
In Arizona, we have incredible community colleges and workforce training programs, and these programs can build the workforce that we need. It's just a matter of finding the individuals, getting them through the door, getting the training they need, get them connected with the employers. I think we can do this. I do also think that we, like anything, we need to have a plan. Thank you, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Senator, thank you very much. Now, let me recognize the senator. I don't know if he's the senior senator, but he got more votes from Georgia, Senator Warnock.
Because my last name begins with a W and Senator Ossoff's begins with an O, I'm the junior senator. Imagine that. Thank you, Chairman Beyer, and I'm glad to be here to be a part of this hearing. People have had to make really hard decisions throughout the pandemic when it comes to their jobs and protecting themselves and their families and their communities. I don't think we've taken stock, really, of the trauma visited upon all of us at varying levels as a result of this pandemic. And not everybody's had the privilege of working remotely. I think especially about our essential workers. That's a term that emerged during the pandemic. The people who literally risked their lives stocking grocery store shelves and working in other facilities and hospitals in some cases. We call them essential workers. Often they don't make an essential wage. They don't earn essential benefits. Leading into the pandemic, only about 9% of the lowest wage earners in the country were able to work from home. Dr. Stevenson, can you speak to how policies that support the financial freedom of working families, like the child tax credit, the largest tax cut for working families in American history, how this might affect the growth and stability of the labor market?
Thank you for that question. I mean, I think the most important thing that the child tax credit does is eliminates or dramatically reduces the amount of children living in poverty. And what that does for children is ensures that they eat better, that they learn better, and that they're better able to grow into adults who will ultimately be productive. But it also gives a little bit more flexibility to the families to make the right choices for them. Families shouldn't be stuck in a situation where if something happens, we've all been there, where a kid breaks an arm or a leg, and you have to keep going to work, but who's gonna take care of them? Giving them just a little bit more breathing room allows them to make better decisions. And we saw in the pandemic that people got up and went to jobs that could kill them. But the financial support we gave has allowed them to move into better jobs as we've emerged out of the pandemic, to make requests for higher wages, for more flexibility. Flexibility doesn't just mean working at home. It means knowing what your schedule is more than 24 hours in advance so you can plan for childcare. It means trying to ask for working around your childcare schedule so that you can actually go to work and do your job. These kinds of demands that workers are now currently making are being facilitated by the fact that you and Congress, in its wisdom, has chosen to give a little bit more of a cushion to families so that they can make better choices for them and their children.
Families for whom wages are low and the cost of childcare is high.
Yes.
And this just gives them some space. So you don't believe that this is a negative impact on the economy?
I do not believe it's a negative impact. In fact, I think it's a very strongly positive impact on the economy. I think that most people want to be able to work, provide more for their children, but they need a little bit of a buffer because when things start to fall apart, what we see is people can have a really hard time getting themselves out of the worst situations. So that's particularly true for low-wage workers.
And similarly, we've heard folks in recent days say that the unemployment insurance that we provided is what's contributing to this issue. And some have argued that taking away unemployment payments was necessary to get people back to work. But the evidence that I've seen isn't there. In states like Georgia that ended benefits early, there was not a significant difference in the number of jobs created in comparison to other states that kept the benefits. Further, a report by the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta found that even though women with small children made up just 10% of the pre-pandemic workforce, they are almost 25% of the COVID-related job loss. So these are folks who are responding to this very issue that you're talking about. It's not that parents don't want to work. Raising a small child, and I have 2 small children, during a pandemic without reliable child care or other supports, it's a full-time job, and it makes it nearly impossible to work. Mr. Amernath, does limiting Americans' access to financial support increase our overall economic growth?
I think it's quite clearly the opposite from the past 18 months. We have some pretty clear data about how income supports ultimately preserve consumption, preserve jobs, preserve the ability for businesses to stay open and not have to go bankrupt. And that's true especially from the on the household side with unemployment insurance. So there was obviously a lot talked about disincentives, how this was actually stopping people from entering. And we had a few different ways we could actually game out whether this was actually happening. Leave aside whether the incentive, how much of an effect it was having. We could look at the cutoff in September for a lot of states who actually kept it in place. And did job growth speed up as we got closer to September and through September? No. We can look at the states, we have weekly data for states that cut it off early. And do we see a difference in terms of how quickly their employment rates accelerated through that early cutoff? And we didn't see that either. That's to reference what Dr. Stevenson noted in her testimony that Erin Dubé has from the weekly data, we don't see that. And then we can also just look at across the income spectrum. Do we see that when we gave a fixed payment, did it actually translate into people at the lower end of the income spectrum? Did job growth slow for those who are at the lowest wage level? That we didn't see either. So we have all these different ways to triangulate and actually evaluate this. And I'm sure there's obviously ways we can keep going back and forth, but on the other side of the ledger, that income helped support consumption for a lot of people who otherwise would have had to cut back drastically. And that's a really important thing. The share of people who would have had to face a big financial loss in terms of a lack of employment, who didn't have to go through that. There's pretty clear data. JP Morgan has evaluated people's financial balances across the income spectrum, and there were a number of people who would have faced a really big financial downturn because of the loss of employment that didn't have to. And that meant that they could also be engaged in economic activity that was supportive of their own standard of living and the standard of living of others.
Thank you so much. I often say that the right thing to do is often the smart thing to do as well. And this gives us insight about how to grow the economy in a way that embraces all of us, especially hardworking, middle-class people, the working poor. Thank you so much.
Senator, thank you very much. 90% of the Joint Economic Committee is just showing up. So we're going to do a second round, and you're welcome to stay if you.
They are dragging me to the next thing.
I understand. And if my friend Mr. Schweiker comes back, or anyone else, we'll be happy to welcome them. But let me just start a short second round. Dr. Stevenson, there was a Heritage report on September 30th, just 7 weeks ago, and that said, quote, "The proposed subsidies for full-time center-based childcare would arguably subtract from the benefits of a loving, resourceful family by reducing parenting and increasing paid time in the labor force, particularly for mothers." At the same time, Ms. Grensler talked about the child tax credit stuff, the $250 and $300 payments are unfortunate because they would encourage mothers, parents to go back into the workforce. You're a mom of two. Should that loving, resourceful family be reserved just for wealthy families?
I appreciate you asking that question, and I feel strongly no. It should not be reserved just for wealthy families. There is, obviously a strong back and forth between a desire to encourage work, which I think we're all in agreement. Everybody here wants to see people who can work, but there are times when parents do need to be at home. What we're looking at is making childcare affordable so that parents can make the right choice for themselves. And I think there are a lot of parents that unfortunately find themselves in a situation where childcare is so unaffordable that they're unable to do it. Center-based childcare isn't just about childcare, it's also about learning. The pandemic has shown us that learning and childcare are two sides of the same coin. When we send our kids to K through 12 education, we are not just sending them to learn, we're also sending them to someone else who's going to be taking care of them while we work. Center-based childcare also provides both learning, early learning, and care that allows parents to work. I think the subsidies there give parents a choice. They don't force anyone to do anything, unlike a work requirement on child tax credits.
Very great, thank you. Mr. Amarnath, you talk about the skills gap myth, that the differential in employment rates between those with a college education and those without has actually narrowed over time. But we've been talking about the skills gap for a long time. The 10 million jobs, 7 million people, whatever, out of work, and it's because they don't have the right things. Can you explore that?
Sure. So I think it requires a little bit of nuance, but I think it's when we look at college employment rates and those with only a high school diploma, right? There is a differential, and people say that's something that's so structural, there's no way to be able to get beyond a certain level of employment for those who don't have beyond a high school diploma. And this was especially a prominent argumentation coming out of the Great Recession, that all these construction workers can't be employed doing something else unless it takes a lot of time and cost, and it's going to create a lot of inflation. And as we saw from 2015 onwards, that gap narrowed. And that gap narrowed as the labor market tightened, and demand had slowly recovered. Whereas right now we see, especially when we're kind of going into overdrive with the current recovery relative to those previous recoveries, at least benchmark it against that, that we do see that there's a demand for a lot of that type of labor that has been highly cyclical, that was probably not as stable a job previously, and we're trying to make a lot of those essential jobs, whether they're in manufacturing, construction, maintenance. These are areas where there's been a lack of stability over the years, and that's part of the reason that those jobs may have been otherwise been done by people who did not have a college degree, but could be good paying jobs if under the right conditions. Especially if we sort of subsidize training, we are able to actually bring people in. So I think the skills gap itself is a prediction of who's employed and who's employable. There's obviously a role government can play in sort of facilitating that process, but the notion that this is some hard constraint as opposed to something that we can work through, I guess that's the way I would frame it from here, which is there are areas where there's probably room to do more, but these are always challenges that always exist that some level of persistent effort can bring people in. And we shouldn't write off people just because their educational attainment levels are different, or that only the people with a college degree are somehow able to find gainful employment that pays a good wage.
This ties in really nicely, although uncertainly, with the whole notion of retraining workers. You know, in an economy where we celebrate creative destruction, whether it's driven by technology or by trade or anything else, what do we do with those coal workers in Southwest Virginia, for example? It's a challenge.
Yeah, I think in the case of, there's a tendency to sort of say that people have to switch drastically into new jobs, that somehow people have to go learn to code, or construction workers need to become nurses. This was a common claim in 2010 and 11. And actually, I would take strong issue with that. And we're seeing that part of the reason was we did not take the recovery seriously enough last time around, at least in terms of the policies that were implemented. And this time around, we are seeing that there are job openings in a lot of these areas that were supposedly written off. Manufacturing jobs are actually in high demand right now. And that's a product of how we actually craft policy, both to create the demand and the supply for the workforce itself. That's important.
Thank you. Dr. Stevenson, there's a fascinating article in today's Atlantic by Derek Thompson on this exact subject, and he talks about how the great resignation, quote unquote, seems to be accelerating along with the remote work revolution in the knowledge economy. But let me quote directly. I love your thoughts on this, especially with your Council of Economic Advisors background. Quote, much of the labor force seems to be participating in a kind of distributed protest against the status quo of work in America. And quote, this may be a pivotal turning point in the relationship between labor and capital. Is all this overstated?
I don't think that it's overstated. You know, the labor share of income has been declining for the last 20 to 30 years. When I was a graduate student, I was taught that that thing is stable, that it never changes, that what workers get is always sort of roughly the same share, even as GDP grows. And yet we've seen this decline that has been a function of big companies that rely on less labor becoming a greater share of the economy, and workers with low skills being treated really like they're disposable. What we see, you know, if you look in the industries that are hurting the most today, those are the industries that tend to have very, very high turnover in the best of times. And not just because workers are quitting, but because they let them go. Oh, there's no demand, don't come in today. But I was on the schedule, I arranged childcare. Doesn't matter, we don't need you. That kind of treatment workers have been putting up with for a long time. When I was on the Council of Economic Advisors, we brought together employers and software manufacturers who made scheduling software and said, what is going on? Why can't you just make shifts work a little bit better for people so that they can plan their childcare better? And the response from the software developers was, we can, if that's what employers want. So employers have to want it. And the way for them to want it is to find that they have to work a little bit harder to get workers. And that's what we're seeing in the labor market today. And that collective movement, in effect, what I have called a national collective bargaining moment, is leading workers to demand more and get more.
Great. Thank you very much. Anybody else want to add? I'm just kidding. In any case, thank you all very much. Ms. Gressler, Mr. Swenson-Klatt, Mr. Amarnath, Dr. Stevenson, we really appreciate your hanging in. We're going to get thrown out of the room in about 11 minutes, but I'm really grateful. There's been a wonderful discussion, and we actually had many people here for their 5 minutes, which is very helpful. So understanding how to create a policy environment that encourages the creation of well-paying, high-quality, safe jobs, including all the perspectives, is a really critical issue for Congress, for business, for workers. The pandemic certainly has highlighted some of the structural challenges holding back labor force participation. And the current demand for strong workers gives us an opportunity to really explore this and get people back into the labor force. So thank you for your contributions. Thank you to my colleagues. The record will remain open for 3 business days, and this hearing is now adjourned.